150 years after Columbus's arrival, European colonization of the Americas had seen great success. The five major European colonial powers had all carved out significant chunks of the New World for themselves, forcing those already there to adapt, accept, or resist, if they hadn't already died from disease. The second half of the 17th century would only prove that the Europeans were there to stay, as the New World became the arena for imported European wars, radical political and religious experiments, and lucrative industries built off the backs of servants and slaves. The story of European colonization was only getting faster and more intense. We'll start with England, or rather, New England, which by 1650 boasted 40 towns and 23,000 colonists. Conscious of their rising prosperity and shared cultures, the New England Confederation was formed in 1643 to unify the colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, in what proved to be foreshadowing for future colonial cooperation. The small outcast colony of Rhode Island was omitted from the Confederation, and New Haven was annexed entirely by Connecticut in 1664. But already, New England was taking a recognizable shape. Religious dissent, a frontier mentality with deep connections to the Native Americans, and a proud culture of independence from the crown defined New England against the old. Economically, New England was never the most lucrative of England's colonies. The West Indies far outclassed it in wealth generated, but the quality of life New Englanders could enjoy was high. The average family could expect to own lands to farm what they needed, and propertied men could expect a role in influencing politics that was more direct than what a typical Englishman across the Atlantic would expect. While the sugar fortunes of the Caribbean eclipsed New England's humble economy, it benefited from good agricultural land, vast fishing stocks, and huge forests for lumber. By 1700, New England's fishing and shipbuilding industries was among the best in the world, and England itself was buying some of its vessels from them. Most importantly for most New Englanders, colonial life offered them the freedom to worship as they pleased. Puritanism's dominance in New England was already fading, as an even wider tapestry of religious denominations, including Baptists, Congregationalists, and Quakers, flocked to the freedom of the New World. Not all was as it seemed, though. Religious toleration was defined in strict Protestant dissenter limits. Anglicans were not welcome, nor Catholics, and even the Quakers faced significant discrimination. They were banished from Massachusetts in the 1650s, and at least 4 Quakers were hanged for preaching their faith. Religious feeling was high in New England, and nothing showed the risks of that like the Salem witch trials of 1691 and 1692, where intense paranoia led to hundreds being accused and 19 people executed for the imagined crime of witchcraft. Relations with the indigenous people were also difficult. In 1675, New England experienced a wave of conflict with the Algonquin natives led by a warrior named Metacomet, but who was known to the English as King Philip. The New Englanders had demanded Metacomet's people surrender weapons and land to them, and Metacomet agreed at first, but as their demands grew, he knew they could either fight or lose everything. King Philip's war led to more than half of New England's towns being attacked and a dozen being burned to the ground, and harsh reprisals against the Algonquins led to the destruction of many settlements and food stores belonging to Metacomet's men. The war lasted until August 1676, when Metacomet was shot by an Indian Christian convert and the Native Alliance collapsed without his leadership. Anger at Native Americans was intense in the wake of the war, and some Virginians called for the total expulsion of Native Americans from the territory. Governor William Berkeley refused, but quickly found himself with a rebellion on his hands by discontented Virginians. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, named for its leader Nathaniel Bacon, called for Berkeley's dismissal and a total expulsion of Native Americans from Virginia. The rebellion was swiftly put down by government loyalists, but not before several loyalist settlements were attacked and over 100 Native Americans were killed. Although it lasted only a few months, Bacon's rebellion was remarkable for two key reasons. First, it involved both white settlers and Africans, slave and non-slave, against the Native Americans. The realization that the two groups might unify caused the colonial government to draw stricter legal separation between black and white to ensure they wouldn't rise up again, which encouraged racial division and hostility in the long term. It was also the first significant rebellion by colonists against colonial rule. It would not be the last, and future historians have seen in Bacon's rebellion the first seeds that would sprout into the American Revolution a century later. The remaining Indians in New England scattered, or were enslaved, or were forced into second-class citizen status in so-called praying towns, which were supposed to be the centers of Christian conversion, but mostly functioned as reservations. The hostility between New Englanders and natives remained, and this attitude is best seen in the words of Massachusetts minister Solomon Stoddard, writing to the governor in 1682, who suggested dogs be trained to hunt Indians. Quote, "They act like wolves and are to be dealt with as wolves." Moving north from New England, the Dutch in New Netherland were also eager to assert their place. The Dutch had been a competitive player in American colonization. With New Netherlands in the north, multiple islands in the Caribbean, and a valuable presence in Brazil, the Dutch had carved out a decent chunk of the colonial pie. However, the mid-17th century proved that the Dutch were overstretched. Their wide presence encroached on the interests of multiple rival powers, especially the British and the Portuguese, that provoked conflict with each. Since 1630, the Dutch had claimed a portion of northern Brazil from the Portuguese, which they had dubbed New Holland. The colony was their way to break into the sugar trade, but the relatively low number of Dutch settlers were forever outnumbered by Brazilian natives and Portuguese settlers who never accepted Dutch rule. In 1645, the Portuguese in New Holland rebelled, defeated the Dutch forces, and invited the Portuguese Empire to claim the territory. The Dutch scrambled an expeditionary force to reclaim the colony, but they were decisively defeated at the two battles of Guararapes in 1648 and 1649. The last Dutch colonists in Brazil held out in the city of Recife until 1654, when Portugal finally kicked them out of South America. The Dutch saw similar disaster up north. The British recognized that New Netherland would be a perfect entry point to deal with the French upriver in Canada and would allow them to control the unbroken span of the eastern seaboard. England realized that the Dutch had overexerted themselves and were weak in the wake of their defeats in Brazil. So, on August 27, 1664, British ships sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam and demanded the surrender of the entire colony. With no forces to resist, the Dutch colonial administrators surrendered. A few months later, the Second Anglo-Dutch War erupted in Europe. As well as preventing any Dutch attempts to reclaim the colonies, the war gave Britain the chance to seize some of its possessions in the Caribbean too, like Tobago. The Dutch did manage to acquire Suriname from the British, but with the end of the war in 1667, the Dutch had clearly lost their place as one of the major colonial powers in the Americas. With the Dutch out of the way in North America, the English were free to expand their control of the eastern seaboard. Aside from New England, Canada, and the Carolinas, the British now had to concern themselves with the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. When taken from the Dutch, New Netherland was under the control of James, Duke of York, the younger brother of King Charles II, and soon to be king himself. New Amsterdam was renamed New York, but its Dutch inhabitants were mostly left alone. James instructed his appointed governors to rule with a gentle hand, but power remained firmly in his grasp. New York was given no elected assembly, and the proprietor could wield power as he pleased. James could never hope to actively govern such a large area from so far away, so in 1664, he cut off a chunk of New Netherlands to grant to his allies Lords John Berkeley and Sir John Carteret. Rather than develop this new area of New Jersey, they sold their shares to another group, the Quakers. The Quakers were heavily persecuted back in England, so the colonies offered a perfect chance to start anew. Jersey received a steady stream of new Quaker settlers to add to the existing Dutch population. But the true success of Quaker colonization was Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was created in 1681 when King Charles II granted proprietary rights to the Quaker financier William Penn. Penn envisioned a new society across the Atlantic where Quakers and other religious minorities could live peacefully and without persecution. In 1682, some 2,000 settlers made the trip to Pennsylvania, where they founded its capital at Philadelphia, and about 6,000 more followed by 1685. Penn was happy to grant generous parcels of lands to smallholders, Quaker and non-Quaker alike, to build his society. With an elected assembly and significant local and individual freedom, Pennsylvania was a thriving model for New World colonization, but not a perfect one. More staunch Quakers wanted Penn to prioritize building a religious society, while Penn was still a proprietor who was always careful to ensure profits kept climbing. This left some Quakers to leave Pennsylvania in favor of Quaker-controlled New Jersey, but Penn's work seemed to pay off anyway. By 1700, Pennsylvania was home to 18,000 colonists, and Philadelphia was rapidly becoming one of the largest, wealthiest, and best-educated cities in America. Disruption came in 1685 when the newly crowned James II ordered the unification of New England with New York and New Jersey to create the crown-controlled Dominion of New England. Local authority was severely limited, and Anglican and even Catholic worship was to be tolerated. Alas, James proved to be an unpopular monarch and was peacefully deposed in favor of the Dutch Prince William and his wife Mary during the Glorious Rebellion of 1688. It took until the next few years for news to reach the colonies. The Dominion government, loyal to James II, was reluctant to give up power, but rebellions in New York and Massachusetts forced the Dominion to collapse. However, King William III was not so eager to let royal control slip. The Dominion was dissolved back into separate colonies, but he imposed royal governors upon Massachusetts and New Hampshire to tighten English control and maintained a more tolerant religious policy that spelled the end of Puritan dominance in New England. Beyond that, there are two other areas of English colonization worthy of attention. In 1649, King Charles I lost his head, and England passed to the control of Oliver Cromwell. A staunch Puritan with an insatiable hatred of Catholics, Britain spent most of Cromwell's reign locked in war with Catholic Spain. The main result of this being the British capture of Jamaica in 1655, giving Britain control of one of the largest and most lucrative sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean. Combined with Barbados and the Leeward Isles like Antigua, Montserrat, and St. Nevis, Britain was well positioned to turn the Caribbean into a sugar-producing powerhouse. While the North American colonies are better known, the 17th and early 18th century was really the age of Britain's Caribbean empire. Hundreds of thousands of tons of sugar sailed back across the Atlantic from Britain's Caribbean colonies over the following decades. At first, indentured whites were the main labor force. Again, Cromwell being in power at the start had special relevance. He needed a place to put all those pesky Irish and Scots he captured, and forcing them across the Atlantic to grow sugar for him was as good a plan as any. But English and Welsh indentures were sent as well. Of the 223,000 white colonists who came to the Caribbean between 1630 and 1700, around half of them were indentured servants, almost all of them bound for sugar production. Soon enough, though, demand for labor outstripped the indentured supply, and slavery came to dominate. The Caribbean was the primary destination for slaves in Britain's transatlantic slave trading, and the numbers grew sharply between 1642 and 1700. The founding of the Royal Africa Company in 1672 ensured the smooth transportation of slaves to the Caribbean colonies. Barbados had around 5,700 African slaves in 1645, swelling to 42,000 by 1698, while Jamaica's 1,410 slaves in 1656 had become over 41,000 in 1698. The slave population significantly outnumbered the white population, who kept control with violence and aggressive legal codes that restricted slaves and defined their status as innate and inherent to their skin color. In contrast to New England with its many independent land-owning families and pleasant towns, the Caribbean colonies were a place where most people lived in servitude to a narrow plantation elite who'd grown rich from the enslavement of others. By 1700, Caribbean sugar was producing some 3 million pounds of value per year at the cost of about 200,000 African slaves brought into the British Caribbean or North American ports. Plantation wealth was also key to the other great arena of British colonial efforts, Carolina. In 1663, Charles II granted land rights to 8 powerful proprietors in the territory of Carolina. The first permanent settlement was laid down at Charleston in 1670, and Carolina quickly grew to be a valuable colony with a thriving slave plantation economy in the south, with more independent family farming-based communities in the north. The proprietors were mostly hands-off, taking little interest in the colony from their comfy homes back in England. The one exception was the Earl of Shaftesbury, who, along with the philosopher John Locke, attempted to craft Carolina into a perfect society. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina attempted to outline a society that blended liberal ideas of freedom and democracy with slavery and hereditary nobility. The bizarre experiment was a failure from start to finish. Carolinans resented the proprietors' out-of-touch attempts to remake society, which they answered with resistance, or just by ignoring them entirely to focus on their farms and plantations. Still, by 1700, royal power was probably the strongest it had been in the British colonies since settlement began. But this fact did not sit comfortably among the American colonists. After generations, most of them had little loyalty to the mother country, and with the soaring prosperity and stability of colonial life, many began to feel that the colonies had surpassed England. Did a distant country few of them had ever visited really deserve to rule them? That question would only grow louder as the 18th century dawned. There's no talking about the British without addressing the French, who took the lead in colonizing Canada and the inland areas of North America. 1642 saw the French settle another new colony in Montreal, deepening their foothold in the north. France's main concern was to establish its influence over and security in the Great Lakes region, but doing this required engaging with the great power that was already there, the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was an alliance of 5 nations: the Cayuga, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, and the Seneca, who had joined together under the Great Law of Peace to end fighting in the region centuries before the Europeans arrived. Naturally, the Iroquois were wary about the newcomers, and like many Native American groups, they navigated the arrival of the Europeans with an eye to their own interests. With the French posing a bigger threat to their ancestral territory, the Iroquois took advantage of France's rivalry with England and the Netherlands to trade with Dutch and English merchants for weapons, which they could then use to resist French encroachment on their land. The Beaver Wars raged for most of the 17th century. As French settlers encroached on their territory, the Iroquois resisted with violent force. In turn, they launched attacks on French settlements, traders, and explorers. Other indigenous groups like the Huron took a different approach. Seeking alliances with the French, the Huron and several other indigenous groups, many with long-standing rivalries with the Iroquois, took up arms against them. The resulting Beaver Wars were as much, if not more so, a conflict between differently aligned native peoples as it was a war between the French and the native peoples. As in every corner of the Americas, there was no single unified response to European settlement, and different groups fought, traded, ignored, integrated, and cooperated as they saw fit. Fighting rose and fell over the century. An extended period of peace between the French and Iroquois began from 1666 as the latter turned their attention to other native groups, but war resumed in the 1680s. The 9 Years' War between Britain and France, which began in 1688, spilled over into the Americas as King William's War, with the Iroquois allied with the British and the Huron with the French, triggering a renewed wave of conflict that only ended with peace in 1697. By that point, the Iroquois controlled much of the New England frontier and the Ohio River Valley. Beyond Canada, France's primary interest lay in the Mississippi River Basin. They explored the basin from the 1670s, and in 1682, René Robert Cavalier de La Salle declared the entire river system to be the French possession of Louisiana. Louisiana was divided into upper and lower regions separated at the Arkansas River. Upper Louisiana was formed from the upper Mississippi Valley, which included today's states of Illinois, Missouri, and Indiana, while everything to the south was lower Louisiana. French settlers from Canada moved into the area in the late 17th century, attracted by the vast fertile farming land. The upper Louisiana region also had an abundance of animals that could be hunted for furs or food. Early settlement in lower Louisiana was hard and unsuccessful. The first permanent French colony was actually in modern Texas at Fort St. Louis. Founded in 1685, it lasted just 3 years before indigenous locals conquered it and slaughtered the population. Small villages and forts were planted across the Louisiana Territory with more success, but large-scale colonization would have to wait until the 18th century. While the French weren't having the best time of it in the second half of the 17th century, they could at least say they were doing better than the Spanish. Spain's experiences in the New World were downstream of their troubles in the Old. The second half of the 17th century was one of difficulty for the Spanish crown, which sapped attention and resources from the Americas. The rising power of France, especially during the long reign of Louis XIV and the breakdown of the Iberian Union between Spain and Portugal, left the Spanish crown weak and exhausted. Their French, Dutch, Portuguese, and English rivals were keen to capitalize on that, such as England seizing Jamaica in 1655. Spain had plenty of trouble from the Americas too. Massive native depopulation had severely limited the labor supply, and Spain was unable to muscle its way into the Atlantic slave trade. Spanish colonies struggled to find the labor needed to produce sugar or mine the gold and silver which had made the empire so wealthy. The slaves they did buy were mostly bought through their imperial rivals. Meanwhile, the native populations who remained became increasingly resistant to Spanish rule. In Peru, the native Inca launched dozens of small-scale rebellions against exploitative Spanish practices, including forced labor for the state and price gouging by Spanish officials, who forced them to buy tools and supplies from overpriced Spanish sources, then sell their produce to the Spanish at a discounted price, which the Spanish then sold on for a profit. Specific areas brought their own problems too. Spanish settlement in Florida slowed to a trickle, as a lack of exploitable resources or exploitable native labor caused interest in the region to wane. With the British and French expanding even further southward, Florida became more of a buffer for the more valuable Caribbean and Central American colonies than it was a valuable holding itself. Not that Florida protected Spanish ships in the Caribbean from their real scourge, pirates. The second half of the 17th century was the golden age of piracy, with European ships constantly harassed by independent pirates or privateers backed by their rivals. The English proved especially bothersome with privateers based out of Charlestown, modern-day Nassau in the Bahamas. A Spanish fleet successfully raided the town and burned it to the ground in 1684, but the pirate menace was far from solved. With Inca rebels in the south, pirates in the Caribbean, and rival Europeans everywhere, it is probably no surprise that Spain faced resistance in its North American territory of New Mexico too. The Pueblo people of New Mexico had long suffered under Spanish rule, and in 1680 they launched a full-scale rebellion. Named for its warrior leader, Pope's rebellion led to the expulsion of Spanish settlers from New Mexico and the killing of several hundred of them. It was one of the most successful examples of indigenous resistance in the Americas, but that success was short-lived. Pope died in 1688, and without his leadership, the will for independence faded. When the Spanish returned in 1692, they were able to peacefully convince the majority of the Pueblo people to accept Spanish rule again. However, the Spanish no longer subjected the Pueblo to forced labor on the exploitative encomienda system, and rolled back missionary work in their communities, allowing the Pueblans to retain more of their independence and culture than most Native American groups did under colonial rule. That leaves us with Portugal, who experienced more stable dominance in South America. The expulsion of the Dutch in 1654 assured Portuguese control of Brazil, and the 1668 Treaty of Lisbon further secured their sphere of influence by ending hostilities with Spain. As a result, Portugal was free to expand and refine its colonial control and turn Brazil into the global powerhouse of sugar production and slave exploitation. Portugal tightened up colonial administration with an overseas council to manage colonial affairs and the expansion of the use of colonial administrators and local elites known as the Senhores de Engenho to manage local affairs. As in the Caribbean, slavery was the engine that powered Brazil. By 1700, 500,000 African slaves had been shipped there, and more were born into servitude from those imported slaves. The life expectancy of a fresh slave brought into Brazil was a few years at most, and most of those born there did not live to see 25. But unlike elsewhere, the Portuguese state was more permissive towards intermarriage and relations between white colonists, indigenous people, and Africans, which was already giving rise to a mestizo population. Race relations in Brazil would forever be different to those in other European colonies as a result. While Brazil's sugar trade grew steadily, the rapid expansion of Caribbean sugar after the 1650s ate away at Portugal's dominance of the trade. Nevertheless, sugar and slavery continued, and inevitably, slaves resisted. As early as 1603, escaped slaves had been gathering at Palmares, but after the Dutch expulsion in 1654, the numbers of escaped slaves swelled. By the 1670s, this community of escaped slaves was styling itself as an independent kingdom named Angola Janga. Multiple Portuguese attempts to shut it down failed against the difficult tropical terrain and fierce resistance of the warriors. Its self-styled King Ganga Zumba commanded soldiers, regulated trade in his territory, and even built himself a palace. In 1678, the Portuguese officially recognized him as a legitimate ruler so long as he submitted to Portuguese authority, becoming a sort of client king. Zumba agreed, but such a capitulation was not welcomed by his rivals. His nephew, Zumbi, launched a revolt. Ganga Zumba was killed and Zumbi took his place. For the next 15 years, Zumbi doggedly defended Palmares' independence. Eventually, though, in January 1694, another Portuguese expedition under Domingos Jorge Velho assaulted Zumbi's seat of power at Cerca de Macaco, conquering it and capturing Zumbi, who was eventually beheaded. The suppression of Palmares was a welcome development for the Portuguese, but it was a reminder of the risks of the sugar trade and its dependence on slaves. So, the discovery of gold in the Minas Gerais region of Brazil by Portuguese explorers in the 1690s offered a welcome new source of wealth as Portugal entered the new century. By 1700, then, European colonization in the Americas had successfully planted numerous prosperous societies with robust economies, political systems, and identities. They offered new opportunities for settlers and profit for their ruling powers. But they also promised bondage for hundreds of thousands of slaves and dispossession for Native Americans. As these colonies continued to grow to stand on their own 2 feet, their dependence on indigenous people and their colonial motherlands would only decline. For better or for worse, these colonies were here to stay.